All right, so let's look at the ideological mobilization for the Cold War in the United States. Now, there are some concerns raised by the Cold War. With its strict one-party rule and government control over the arts and the intellectuals and the economy, the Soviet Union represents a stark opposite to the ideas of democracy and free enterprise that we associated, at least in the Cold War, and even today, with the United States. But there were a number of contemporary critics of the US Cold War policies, very few of them actually sympathetic to the Soviet Union. They weren't communist supporters or subversives or anything like that. But they merely pointed out that casting the battle as a worldwide struggle between freedom and slavery in these very stark contrasts, black and white, no gray areas, had some unfortunate consequences. One, the rather simplistic dichotomy, this sort of black and white, doesn't leave a lot of room for nuance when we think about struggles. A good example of this would be the struggle in Greece. The Greek monarchy was not a great government. They weren't supporters of freedom and democracy. They were an oppressive monarchy. And the Greek people were instituting this revolution as a way to get out from under this oppressive government. The fact that that revolution took on a communist flair didn't necessarily have anything to do with the global struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, but more to do with the fact that they wanted their government to do something for them and not just take it away. Again, nuance is lost in simplistic dichotomies. The inability to see foreign developments on a case-by-case basis, as I've just described, and instead viewing it as an extension of the Cold War led us to jump into bed with some unsavory characters. It also led the United States into making continued interventions abroad in places that arguably we didn't really need to or want to be. Places like Vietnam, for example. We also had a tendency, as I kind of alluded to a minute ago, to side with undemocratic regimes simply because they weren't communist. Anti-communism doesn't necessarily mean free or democratic. And oftentimes, no matter how oppressive to its own people, if a nation joined the anti-communist crusade, it was counted as part of the free world, i.e. somewhere like South Africa, which had the extremely harsh system of apartheid. There would be no question that this was not free or democratic, but it wasn't communist, and so it was okay with us. And that's kind of wrong. We also tended to take aversion to colonial independence as something of an ironic turn for the United States, given our own national origins. This also had huge effects on ideas of freedom. The ideological struggle, the battle for hearts and minds, as it was often referred to, kind of helps to change our ideas of freedoms. And we see this in a number of different places. The way we depict US history changes. We see a tendency to gloss over the more unsavory aspects of US history. We also see the effect in the arts. In films, film scripts were encouraged to remove any allusions to the unsavory parts of US history, like the Indian removals, racial discrimination, the unsavory characteristics of slavery. Art, music, dance, all of these things also tended to follow suit. We also see involvement of national security agencies. The CIA funded overseas publication, conferences, exhibits to try and change the idea that the United States was a cultural backwater, to improve the image of American race relations. They sent Black performers abroad, particularly to places like Asia and Africa. We also see examples in political discourse. Many colonial independence movements evoked the U.S. Declaration of Independence. A coalition of liberal Democrats and Black leaders urged Truman to promote the worldwide decolonization, insisting that free world should not include colonies. But as the Cold War develops, the U.S. backs away from pressuring its European allies to divest themselves of their colonies because of fear that those colonies would ultimately turn to communism. The Cold War and the idea of freedom based largely on the idea of a battle between freedom and slavery, where freedom becomes a very central theme. America is portrayed as a land of pluralism, tolerance, equality, free expression, and individual liberty, and communist regimes as totalitarian, a term which originated in Europe to describe fascist Italy and Germany. Totalitarian means an aggressive, ideologically driven state that sought to subdue all of civil society, including churches, unions, and other voluntary associations, and became a kind of shorthand for describing those on the Soviet side in the Cold War. Socialized resources, medicine, housing, anything like that, also became associated with communism and a negation of freedom. Anything that Moscow stood for, even if arguably it was a good thing, must by definition be the opposite of freedom, despite the fact that some of our allies had embraced similar ideas. It is, in fact, during the 1940s that the NHS, the National Health Service in the UK, comes into being. And so despite the fact that our allies, one of our closest allies, the UK, is embracing this same idea of a socialized healthcare system, it's seen as communistic and evil in the United States. We're also going to see, following the Second World War and as we get into the Cold War, the rise of the idea of human rights. The idea of rights applicable to all humanity actually originated during the Enlightenment, but it has a massive impact with World War II. The atrocities committed during the Second World War and the global language of the four freedoms forced the issue of human rights into the post-war period and put a number of government officials, as we put a number of German officials on trial for crimes against humanity. The drafting of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was approved in 1948, was also a follow-up of this central idea. Eleanor Roosevelt chaired the committee that drafted the declaration, and the rights included things like civil and political liberties, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, protection against arbitrary government, as well as social and economic entitlements, the right to adequate standard of living, access to housing, education, medical care. We also have an affirmation of the global accountability of nations. Even though there is no enforcement mechanism, we do see the introduction of the idea that a nation's treatment of its citizens should be subject to outside evaluation. However, the Cold War will ultimately come into this idea as well, this otherwise wholesome idea. The US will put a lot of emphasis on the political rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Soviets will put a lot of emphasis on the social and economic rights enshrined in the document. And ultimately, the compromise is no compromise at all. We get two separate covenants. The Soviet Union refusing to sign on to a document that includes these political rights, the US refusing to sign on a document that includes social and economic rights. Ultimately, the US has never officially signed on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The ambiguities of human rights are also something of an issue, and it's something that we continue to debate today. These fundamental principles still need some hammering out. National sovereignty and the role that it plays in human rights is also something of a question, and there's no enforcement mechanism, as I mentioned, because both the US and the Soviet Union refused to accept any outside interference in how they run their countries. Many nations were also reluctant to accept interference in internal affairs separate from the US and Soviet Union as well. In the next lecture, we're going to look a little bit more closely at how the United States specifically is carrying out its anti-communist crusade.